Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television and in books. And today I want to talk about different types of media and how that impacts the viewer, the narratee, the person consuming the narrative. Because Ralph Blutax recently had a great video speaking about audiobooks and about how the performance aspect, the performative aspect of audiobooks can change the internal landscape, the imagination that we have that we apply to texts. And it got me thinking about some of the basic assumptions that we make often of conflating all the different types of narrative, be it film, TV, fiction, short fiction. But in a lot of these instances, there's actually a difference in how the audience engages with the text, and also the frame of reference, the way that we engage and how our imaginations are engaged. So let me talk through this a little bit, because I think from the first couple of examples you'll get what I mean. So when we think about film and the history of film, film was and remains a very visual medium. That from silent film, it was about the visuals with title cards being put in, or those inserts that explained dialogue or explained a moment of exposition. But in order to watch film, because we're talking about cinema here, it was all about an actual activity. You went and you did this. You sat down and you started to watch this. You were paying close attention, and it was on a huge screen. And that doesn't detract from the auditory elements, because clearly, even in the silent films, we had orchestras or music playing, soundtracks, special effects being added that were live, played by a band that was actually there. But the dominant language of the narrative was visual. And because you had to travel to it, because it was an event, it was something that you did, and you were sitting in a dark room, you were looking at a large screen, there was a level of focus on this. It wasn't easily accessible. You couldn't just stop the film and do whatever you wanted for a while and then come back. And as film has evolved, as cinema has evolved, that dominance of the visual language of storytelling has been maintained. And tastes may change over time, styles may change over time, appealing to different audiences might change over time, and genres rise and fall. But at the heart of it, cinema remains a very visual storytelling medium. And that contrasts slightly with television, because when we think of television, we think, it's audiovisual. But even until very recently, the predominant language of television was auditory, not visual. And that is not to say that it doesn't borrow and use cinematic visual storytelling techniques. But the audience that is engaging with television, quite frequently, much smaller screen. You can't pick up on the same visual details. It just isn't possible. And now we have these huge screens at home. But for the most part, the language that evolved was very much an auditory form of storytelling with added visuals. And that actually changes how the storytellers approach the narrative, because they know that when you're sitting down to watch a TV program, even if it is event TV and you want to watch it, that it's on a much smaller screen, that we're paying more attention to the auditory clues, and the two work together, but it doesn't focus on visual details to the same extent that cinema did. And in an era of streaming, in which we now have the ability to stop and start TV programs, we can pause live TV in many different circumstances. It changes how we interact with it. It's now on our terms, not on the terms of the narrative being set. And so TV often becomes background noise, and there are distractions because you're sitting in your home or you're sitting at a friend's place. You're watching something and there'll be conversation. It's not the same experience as cinema. And because it's in our own home, because it is far more convenient, we're not necessarily focused on it the same way that we would when we went to the cinema. And so that is built in to the assumptions quite often that writers make about how we engage with TV. And just to take film and TV and how they have changed over time, remember, we can still even then make a distinction between things for mass market, things for a broad global audience, and things for niche audiences. I've just spotted a mosquito. Just to give you the count now, mosquitoes 37, AP2. They started it and are winning, but I'm doing my best. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this is a portable ice pack that I constantly have to refill. It's a reusable, rechargeable sort of ice pack thing because it's over 99 degrees in the shade. Anyway, yes, so I was talking about film and TV, niche audiences, specific types of audience expectation. But the more that you make for a general audience, sometimes writers have to make assumptions about level of knowledge, level of engagement, and they don't always get this right. There was a recent discussion of the Witcher TV show, and one of the producers, who I believe was actually speaking in English, despite that not being his native language. And a lot of people took his comments in the most negative light possible, which is he was talking about how they were trying to simplify what is present in the books for a mainstream audience, and the assumptions that they had made about American audiences, that they needed to simplify things, to dumb things down, to make it broadly understandable. And that reduced the nuance, that reduced what they could do. A lot of people commented on this and saying, oh, he was just being, mean and blah, blah, blah. People can make mistakes, but also this is a common element of making any adaptation. When you think of how a scene is described in a book, there can be significant paragraphs of exposition, internal thoughts of characters, in addition to the dialogue and descriptions of action. But when you try to translate that to the large or even small screen, you're trying to do it in a visual and auditory, or just primarily auditory language, rather than the communication through the written word, which takes me on to radio plays. Radio plays, clearly an auditory medium, that the audience is trying to imagine everything. In film, you didn't need to imagine much. Maybe smell, taste, the tactile senses, and there are ways of suggesting those in film. With TV, again, much the same thing. You are being shown what is happening, you are hearing what is happening, and so in terms of imagination, you're much more passive. Film, I think you can be slightly more active because of that mode we are in when we go to the cinema, and we are focused, we're concentrated, we are watching this, we are paying attention. TV, because of its domestic setting, quite often we are not as active in how we watch it. And because both those media are appealing to visual information as well, we're not actively having to imagine much. But when we get to radio plays, suddenly we have to imagine a lot, which is why radio plays frequently very heavy on dialogue and very heavy, or well, maybe not very heavy, but use Foley artists and these special effects sounds to really create the sense of what is happening, because they can't show it to us. And so listening to a radio play, you need significantly more concentration than you need for a lot of film and a lot of television, because you're actively engaged in trying to imagine what is happening. And it's a very auditory, obviously, form of narrative. And that takes us on to what Raf was talking about in terms of audiobooks. Audiobooks borrow very heavily, particularly the more performative ones now that have soundtracks and special effects and utilize multiple actors to do multiple voices, that these performative aspects are very much an adaptation of the text and narrating it in a very specific vein. And because of the artistic choices taken, that forms an impression of the narrative, which actually reduces the amount of activity required to engage in imagining what is happening. We become slightly more passive recipients. And when we listen to audiobooks, quite often we are listening to audiobooks while we are doing something else. This is one of the great things about audiobooks. You're out cutting the grass. You have your earphones in, you're cutting the grass, you're listening to an audiobook. You're working out and in the gym, listening to an audiobook. You go for a walk, you're listening to an audiobook. But the visual information that you're paying attention to in the world around you, what you're doing, that's divided your focus. So you are not necessarily as active in imagining what is going on in the audiobook. And the performance then fills a lot of that in. But when we get to traditional reading and sitting down with a book, it is entirely active imagination. We have to engage with it because we don't have visual cues, we don't have auditory clues, and so everything is reliant upon reader imagination, reader engagement, reader understanding of the words on the page and how they evoke all the different senses. And it's fascinating because so often when we talk about, oh, what's good dialogue or bad dialogue, we reach for examples from film because they're easy. Lots of people have seen the film. They're not going to get worried about it. It's spoiling one little tiny section. And you can clip it, you can show it, people can hear it. But we forget that dialogue in books and dialogue in film are not necessarily the same, and they're not trying to achieve the same thing. When we talk about pacing and we think of filmic examples, because again, they're very easy to get to and lots of people have seen the film, and particularly in an era where people are so worried about spoilers, slightly unnecessarily in my opinion, but I know that it's not a mainstream opinion and I try to respect people's fear or desires in regard to spoiler information. But when you want to talk about the pacing of a narrative, quite often people fall back on film and TV to talk about pacing, but that is always going to be by analogy. And while it's useful, while we can still talk about general principles, it's not going to be the same as the pacing in a novel, because how pacing is dictated in a novel is going to be very, very different. It is a different medium. It has a different type of engagement. It is relying on a different way to communicate the information. All of these things mean that if you learn pacing or if you learn dialogue solely from film or film and television, you're missing out on the techniques and the ways that it can be done to lean into the strengths of writing. A good example of this, when we think of a sequence that's in a novel and we want good dialogue, one of the fascinating things about this is, firstly, when you have dialogue, it essentially arrests the development of the narrative. You are stopped because you are now watching and imagining two people talking. Action isn't occurring. And so one of the techniques used is to have a couple of lines of dialogue, establish who's talking, and then add in a short paragraph of action exposition, or to start expanding the dialogue and combining it with an action. And by varying sentence length, by varying the white space on the page, by moving between large sections of dialogue, shorter sections of dialogue, all of these different techniques, you can speed up or slow down the reader's movement along a page. And there are analogies to film, but it's not quite the same. If you think of a great speech being made in a film where someone is monologuing, they're giving a speech to everyone. Now imagine if that was just recreated word for word on the page. Open your speech marks, and then it is a page and a half of this one person talking. And that can suddenly slow everything down, because you're not getting the crowd reactions. You're not getting where in the film, quite often, it will do a close-up of the person giving the speech and their face. It'll show reactions in the crowd. It'll show different moments. The camera constantly moves around to stimulate engagement and to stop people getting bored. And yet, by analogy then, we have to think about how that would actually affect writing. which is you don't necessarily want a giant long page and a half or 2 pages of monologue. You want to find ways to break it up. And so by analogy, you think about those camera cuts, you think about the reactions in the crowd, you think about those moments, and you start adding that in. And so it's this backwards and forwards of understanding the techniques are not exactly the same, and reader engagement or narratee engagement is not necessarily the same, but we can learn from the different techniques. We can talk about them as ways to explain and help others visualize what we are discussing. But if you want to give good examples of dialogue, constantly reaching for film or TV is not going to be the key teaching lesson that you want for creative writing. Understanding how dialogue functions in a written narrative is not the same as understanding how dialogue necessarily functions in something that is heavily auditory, like television, where you want more exposition, potentially, in the actual dialogue, because you cannot rely on the fact that viewers are going to see exactly what's going on because it's a much smaller screen. In cinema, you want to show what is going on and have the dialogue build on that. So the intention behind what dialogue is doing in various scenes can change dramatically by the assumptions we make about the narrative engagement, the person this story is being narrated to, whether they are expecting a visual story, whether they're expecting an auditory story, or whether it is entirely text-based. And the techniques that we utilize will change. So when we think about how we engage with narrative, thinking about how active or passive we are in terms of our receipt of the information and imagining that information, that can play into what we value or devalue within any particular text, be it a film, a TV show, a radio play, or a book. These are just different ways of thinking about it to show they're not necessarily the same. It's not saying that one is better than another, and it's not saying that writers can't draw from all of these things to experiment, to push the boundaries of the various media. And certainly with prestige TV, we've seen how there's been a strong movement and focus to producing almost cinematic level TV, but forgetting that not everyone has access to a giant wall-sized TV in their home, that some people are watching it on much smaller TVs. And so if you're reliant on that visual information, that might lead to your audience not catching the things that you want to communicate. If you are making a major feature film that is going to be shown on IMAX or on a big widescreen cinema screen, having a lot of exposition heavy dialogue is going to slow everything down, and your audience may feel talked down to. Trying to replicate cinematic techniques in literature forgets that the engagement and the type of imagination that we are asking our readers to have might actually be quite different. And so these are all just slightly different considerations. And the more we know about all these different techniques, the more we can borrow things that work from one and use it in a different one and play with them and experiment with them. But I am now overheating because it is ridiculously hot here. So I just want to say thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.